Illustrated by Freeze. Martha Dane paused, looking up at the purple-tinged copper sky. The wind had shifted since noon, while she had been inside, and the dust storm that was sweeping the high deserts to the east was now blowing out over Syrtis. The sun, magnified by the haze, was a gorgeous magenta ball, as large as the sun of Terra, at which she could look directly. Tonight, some of that dust would come sifting down from the upper atmosphere to add another film to what had been burying the city for the last 50,000 years. The red lust lay over everything, covering the streets and the open spaces of park and plaza, hiding the small houses that had been crushed and pressed flat under it and the rubble that had come down from the tall buildings when roofs had caved in and walls had toppled outward. Here, where she stood, the ancient streets were 100 to 150 feet below the surface. The breach they had made in the wall of the building behind her had opened into the 6th story. She could look down on the cluster of prefabricated huts and sheds, on the brush-grown flat that had been the waterfront when this place had been a seaport on the ocean that was now Syrtis Depression. Already, the bright metal was thinly coated with red dust. She thought, again, of what clearing this city would mean, in terms of time and labor, of people and supplies and equipment brought across 50 million miles of space. They'd have to use machinery, there was no other way it could be done. Bulldozers and power shovels and draglines, they were fast, but they were rough and indiscriminate. She remembered the digs around Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, in the Indus Valley, and the careful, patient native laborers, the painstaking foremen, the pickmen and spademen, the long files of basketmen carrying away the earth. Slow and primitive as the civilization whose ruins they were uncovering, yes, but she could count on the fingers of one hand the times one of her pickmen had damaged a valuable object in the ground. If it hadn't been for the underpaid and uncomplaining native laborer, archaeology would still be back where Winckelmann had found it. But on Mars there was no native labor, the last Martian had died 500 centuries ago. Something started banging like a machine gun, 400 or 500 yards to her left. A solenoid jackhammer. Tony Latimer must have decided which building he wanted to break into next. She became conscious, then, of the awkward weight of her equipment, and began redistributing it, shifting the straps of her oxytank pack, slinging the camera from one shoulder and the board and drafting tools from the other, gathering the notebooks and sketchbooks under her left arm. She started walking down the road, over hillocks of buried rubble, around snags of wall jutting up out of the loess, past buildings still standing, some of them already breached and explored, and across the brush-grown flat to the huts. There were 10 people in the main office room of Hut 1 when she entered. As soon as she had disposed of her oxygen equipment, she lit a cigarette, her first since noon, then looked from one to another of them. Old Selim von Olmhorst, the Turco-German, one of her 2 fellow archaeologists, sitting at the end of the long table against the farther wall, smoking his big curved pipe and going through a loose-leaf notebook. The girl ordnance officer, Sachiko Koremitsu, between 2 droplights at the other end of the table, her head bent over her work. Colonel Hubert Penrose, the Space Force CO, and Captain Field, the intelligence officer, listening to the report of one of the Airdyne pilots, returned from his afternoon survey flight. A couple of girl lieutenants from Signals, going over the script of the evening telecast, to be transmitted to the Sireno, on orbit 5,000 miles off planet and relayed from thence to Terra via lunar. Sid Chamberlain, the Transspace News Service man, was with them. Like Selim and herself, he was a civilian. He was advertising the fact with a white shirt and a sleeveless blue sweater. And Major Lindemann, the engineer officer, and one of his assistants, arguing over some plans on a drafting board. She hoped, drawing a pint of hot water to wash her hands and sponge off her face, that they were doing something about the pipeline. She started to carry the notebooks and sketchbooks over to where Selim von Olmhorst was sitting, and then, as she always did, she turned aside and stopped to watch Sachiko. The Japanese girl was restoring what had been a book, 50,000 years ago. Her eyes were masked by a binocular loo, the black headband invisible against her glossy black hair, and she was picking delicately at the crumbled page with a hairfine wire set in a handle of copper tubing. Finally, loosening a particle as tiny as a snowflake, she grasped it with tweezers, placed it on the sheet of transparent plastic on which she was reconstructing the page, and set it with a mist of fixative from a little spray gun. It was a sheer joy to watch her. Every movement was as graceful and precise as though done to music after being rehearsed 100 times. "Hello, Martha. It isn't cocktail time yet, is it?" The girl at the table spoke without raising her head, almost without moving her lips, as though she were afraid that the slightest breath would disturb the flaky stuff in front of her. "No, it's only 15:30. I finished my work, over there. I didn't find any more books, if that's good news for you." Sachiko took off the loo and leaned back in her chair, her palms cupped over her eyes. "No, I like doing this. I call it micro-jigsaw puzzles. This book, here, really is a mess." Celine found it lying open, with some heavy stuff on top of it. The pages were simply crushed. She hesitated briefly. "If only it would mean something, after I did it." There could be a faintly critical overtone to that. As she replied, Martha realized that she was being defensive. "It will, someday. Look how long it took to read Egyptian hieroglyphics, even after they had the Rosetta Stone." Sachiko smiled. "Yes. I know. But they did have the Rosetta Stone. And we don't. There is no Rosetta Stone, not anywhere on Mars." A whole race, a whole species, died while the first Cro-Magnon cave artist was daubing pictures of reindeer and bison, and across 50,000 years and 50 million miles there was no bridge of understanding. "We'll find one. There must be something, somewhere, that will give us the meaning of a few words, and we'll use them to pry meaning out of more words, and so on. We may not live to learn this language, but we'll make a start, and someday somebody will." Sachiko took her hands from her eyes, being careful not to look toward the unshaded light, and smiled again. This time Martha was sure that it was not the Japanese smile of politeness, but the universally human smile of friendship. "I hope so, Martha, really I do. It would be wonderful for you to be the first to do it, and it would be wonderful for all of us to be able to read what these people wrote. It would really bring this dead city to life again." The smile faded slowly. "But it seems so hopeless." "You haven't found any more pictures?" Sachiko shook her head. Not that it would have meant much if she had. They had found hundreds of pictures with captions. They had never been able to establish a positive relationship between any pictured object and any printed word. Neither of them said anything more, and after a moment Sachiko replaced the loo and bent her head forward over the book. Celine von Olmhorst looked up from his notebook, taking his pipe out of his mouth. "Everything finished, over there?" he asked, releasing a puff of smoke. Such as it was. She laid the notebooks and sketches on the table. Captain Jekyll started air sealing the building from the 5th floor down, with an entrance on the 6th. He'll start putting in oxygen generators as soon as that's done. I have everything cleared up where he'll be working." Colonel Penrose looked up quickly, as though making a mental note to attend to something later. Then he returned his attention to the pilot, who was pointing something out on a map. Von Olmhorst nodded. "There wasn't much to it, at that," he agreed. "Do you know which building Tony has decided to enter next?" "The tall one with the conical thing like a candle extinguisher on top, I think. I heard him drilling for the blasting shots over that way." "Well, I hope it turns out to be one that was occupied up to the end." The last one hadn't. It had been stripped of its contents and fittings, a piece of this and a bit of that, haphazardly, apparently over a long period of time, until it had been almost gutted. For centuries, as it had died, this city had been consuming itself by a process of autocannibalism. She said something to that effect. Yes. We always find that, except, of course, at places like Pompeii. Have you seen any of the other Roman cities in Italy? He asked. Minturni, for instance? First the inhabitants tore down this to repair that, and then, after they had vacated the city, other people came along and tore down what was left, and burned the stones for lime, or crushed them to mend roads, till there was nothing left but the foundation traces. That's where we are fortunate. This is one of the places where the Martian race perished, and there were no barbarians to come later and destroy what they had left. He puffed slowly at his pipe. Some of these days, Martha, we are going to break into one of these buildings and find that it was one in which the last of these people died. Then we will learn the story of the end of this civilization. And if we learn to read their language, we'll learn the whole story, not just the obituary. She hesitated, not putting the thought into words. We'll find that, sometime, Salim, she said, then looked at her watch. I'm going to get some more work done on my lists, before dinner. For an instant, the old man's face stiffened in disapproval. He started to say something, thought better of it, and put his pipe back into his mouth. The brief wrinkling around his mouth and the twitch of his white mustache had been enough. However, she knew what he was thinking. She was wasting time and effort, he believed, time and effort belonging not to herself but to the expedition. He could be right, too, she realized. But he had to be wrong. There had to be a way to do it. She turned from him silently and went to her own packing case seat, at the middle of the table. Photographs, and photostats of restored pages of books, and transcripts of inscriptions, were piled in front of her, and the notebooks in which she was compiling her lists. She sat down, lighting a fresh cigarette, and reached over to a stack of unexamined material, taking off the top sheet. It was a photostat of what looked like the title page and contents of some sort of a periodical. She remembered it. She had found it herself, 2 days before, in a closet in the basement of the building she had just finished examining. She sat for a moment, looking at it. It was readable, in the sense that she had set up a purely arbitrary but consistently pronounceable system of phonetic values for the letters. The long vertical symbols were vowels. There were only 10 of them, not too many, allowing separate characters for long and short sounds. There were 20 of the short horizontal letters, which meant that sounds like ing or ch or sh were single letters. The odds were millions to 1 against her system being anything like the original sound of the language, but she had listed several thousand Martian words, and she could pronounce all of them. And that was as far as it went. She could pronounce between 3,000 and 4,000 Martian words, and she couldn't assign a meaning to one of them. Salim von Olmhorst believed that she never would. So did Tony Latimer, and he was a great deal less reticent about saying so. So, she was sure, did Sachiko Koremitsu. There were times, now and then, when she began to be afraid that they were right. The letters on the page in front of her began squirming and dancing, slender vowels with fat little consonants. They did that, now, every night in her dreams. And there were other dreams, in which she read them as easily as English. Waking, she would try desperately and vainly to remember. She blinked and looked away from the photostat page. When she looked back, the letters were behaving themselves again. There were 3 words at the top of the page, over and underlined, which seemed to be the Martian method of capitalization. Mastharnervad Tadavas Sornhulva. She pronounced them mentally, leafing through her notebooks to see if she had encountered them before, and in what contexts. All 3 were listed. In addition, Mastar was a fairly common word, and so was Norvad, and so was Nor, but Vod was a suffix and nothing but a suffix. Devas was a word, too, and Ta was a common prefix. Sorn and Hulva were both common words. This language, she had long ago decided, must be something like German. When the Martians had needed a new word, they had just pasted a couple of existing words together. It would probably turn out to be a grammatical horror. Well, they had published magazines, and one of them had been called Mastarnervad to Davas Sornhulva. She wondered if it had been something like the Quarterly Archaeological Review, or something more on the order of sexy stories. A smaller line, under the title, was plainly the issue number and date. Enough things had been found numbered in series to enable her to identify the numerals and determine that a decimal system of numeration had been used. This was the 1754th issue, for Doma, 14837, then Doma must be the name of one of the Martian months. The word had turned up several times before. She found herself puffing furiously on her cigarette as she leafed through notebooks and piles of already examined material. Sachiko was speaking to somebody, and a chair scraped at the end of the table. She raised her head, to see a big man with red hair and a red face, in Space Force green, with the single star of a major on his shoulder, sitting down. Ivan Fitzgerald, the medic. He was lifting weights from a book similar to the one the girl ordnance officer was restoring. "Haven't had time, lately," he was saying, in reply to Sachiko's question. "The Finchley girl's still down with whatever it is she has, and it's something I haven't been able to diagnose yet. And I've been checking on bacteria cultures, and in what spare time I have, I've been dissecting specimens for Bill Chandler. Bill's finally found a mammal. Looks like a lizard, and it's only 4 inches long, but it's a real warm-blooded, gamma-genetic, placental, viviparous mammal. Burrows, and seems to live on what pass for insects here." "Is there enough oxygen for anything like that?" Sachiko was asking. "Seems to be, close to the ground." Fitzgerald got the headband of his Lou adjusted, and pulled it down over his eyes. "He found this thing in a ravine down on the sea bottom, huh? This page seems to be intact. Now, if I can get it out all in one piece." He went on talking inaudibly to himself, lifting the page a little at a time and sliding one of the transparent plastic sheets under it, working with minute delicacy. Not the delicacy of the Japanese girl's small hands, moving like the paws of a cat washing her face, but like a steam hammer cracking a peanut. Field archaeology requires a certain delicacy of touch, too, but Martha watched the pair of them with envious admiration. Then she turned back to her own work, finishing the table of contents. The next page was the beginning of the first article listed. Many of the words were unfamiliar. She had the impression that this must be some kind of scientific or technical journal. That could be because such publications made up the bulk of her own periodical reading. She doubted if it were fiction. The paragraphs had a solid, factual look. At length, Ivan Fitzgerald gave a short, explosive grunt. "Ha! Got it." She looked up. He had detached the page and was cementing another plastic sheet onto it. "Any pictures?" she asked. "None on this side." "Wait a moment." He turned the sheet. "None on this side, either." He sprayed another sheet of plastic to sandwich the page, then picked up his pipe and relighted it. "I get fun out of this, and it's good practice for my hands, so don't think I'm complaining," he said. "But, Martha, do you honestly think anybody's ever going to get anything out of this?" Sachiko held up a scrap of the silicone plastic the Martians had used for paper with her tweezers. It was almost an inch square. "Look, 3 whole words on this piece," she crowed. "Ivan, you took the easy book." Fitzgerald wasn't being sidetracked. "This stuff's absolutely meaningless," he continued. "It had a meaning 50,000 years ago, when it was written, but it has none at all now." She shook her head. "Meaning isn't something that evaporates with time," she argued. "It has just as much meaning now as it ever had. We just haven't learned how to decipher it." "That seems like a pretty pointless distinction," Celine von Olmhorst joined the conversation. There no longer exists a means of deciphering it. We'll find one. She was speaking, she realized, more in self-encouragement than in controversy. How? From pictures and captions? We've found captioned pictures, and what have they given us? A caption is intended to explain the picture, not the picture to explain the caption. Suppose some alien to our culture found a picture of a man with a white beard and mustache sawing a billet from a log. He would think the caption meant, man sawing wood. How would he know that it was really Wilhelm II in exile at Dorn? Sachiko had taken off her loo and was lighting a cigarette. I can think of pictures intended to explain their captions, she said. These picture language books, the sort we use in the service, little line drawings, with a word or phrase under them. Well, of course, if we found something like that, von Olmhorst began. Michael Ventris found something like that. Back in the 50s, Hubert Penrose's voice broke in from directly behind her. She turned her head. The colonel was standing by the archaeologist's table. Captain Field and the Airdyne pilot had gone out. He found a lot of Greek inventories of military stores, Penrose continued. They were in Cretan linear B script, and at the head of each list was a little picture, a sword or a helmet or a cooking tripod or a chariot wheel. That's what gave him the key to the script. Colonel's getting to be quite an archaeologist, Fitzgerald commented. We're all learning each other's specialties on this expedition. I heard about that long before this expedition was even contemplated. Penrose was tapping a cigarette on his gold case. I heard about that back before the 30 Days War, at intelligence school, when I was a lieutenant. As a feat of cryptanalysis, not an archaeological discovery. Yes, cryptanalysis, von Olmhorst pounced. The reading of a known language in an unknown form of writing. Ventris lists were in the known language, Greek. Neither he nor anybody else ever read a word of the Cretan language until the finding of the Greek-Cretan bilingual in 1963, because only with a bilingual text, one language already known, can an unknown ancient language be learned. And what hope, I ask you, have we of finding anything like that here? Martha, you've been working on these Martian texts ever since we landed here, for the last 6 months. Tell me, have you found a single word to which you can positively assign a meaning? Yes, I think I have one. She was trying hard not to sound too exultant. Doma. It's the name of one of the months of the Martian calendar. Where did you find that? Von Olmhorst asked. And how did you establish? Here. She picked up the photostat and handed it along the table to him. I'd call this the title page of a magazine. He was silent for a moment, looking at it. Yes. I would say so, too. Have you any of the rest of it? I'm working on the first page of the first article, listed there. Wait till I see. Yes, here's all I found, together, here. She told him where she had gotten it. I just gathered it up, at the time, and gave it to Jeffrey and Rosita to photostat. This is the first I've really examined it. The old man got to his feet, brushing tobacco ashes from the front of his jacket, and came to where she was sitting, laying the title page on the table and leafing quickly through the stack of photostats. Yes, and here is the second article, on page 8, and here's the next one. He finished the pile of photostats. A couple of pages missing at the end of the last article. This is remarkable, surprising that a thing like a magazine would have survived so long. Well, this silicone stuff the Martians used for paper is pretty durable, Hubert Penrose said. There doesn't seem to have been any water or any other fluid in it originally, so it wouldn't dry out with time. Oh, it's not remarkable that the material would have survived. We've found a good many books and papers in excellent condition. But only a really vital culture, an organized culture, will publish magazines, and this civilization had been dying for hundreds of years before the end. It might have been 1,000 years before the time they died out completely that such activities as publishing ended. Well, look where I found it, in a closet in a cellar. Tossed in there and forgotten, and then ignored when they were stripping the building. Things like that happen. Penrose had picked up the title page and was looking at it. I don't think there's any doubt about this being a magazine, at all. He looked again at the title, his lips moving silently. Mast Harnervad Tadavas Sornhulva. Wonder what it means. But you're right about the date. Doma seems to be the name of a month. Yes, you have a word, Dr. Dane. Sid Chamberlain, seeing that something unusual was going on, had come over from the table at which he was working. After examining the title page and some of the inside pages, he began whispering into the stenophone he had taken from his belt. Don't try to blow this up to anything big, Sid, she cautioned. All we have is the name of a month, and Lord only knows how long it'll be till we even find out which month it was. Well, it's a start, isn't it? Penrose argued. Grotefend only had the word for king when he started reading Persian cuneiform. But I don't have the word for month, just the name of a month. Everybody knew the names of the Persian kings, long before Grotefend. That's not the story, Chamberlain said. What the public back on Terra will be interested in is finding out that the Martians published magazines, just like we do. Something familiar, make the Martians seem more real. More human. 3 men had come in, and were removing their masks and helmets and oxytanks, and peeling out of their quilted coveralls. 2 were Space Force lieutenants. The third was a youngish civilian with close-cropped blonde hair, in a checked woolen shirt. Tony Latimer and his helpers. Don't tell me Martha finally got something out of that stuff, he asked, approaching the table. He might have been commenting on the antics of the village halfwit, from his tone. Yes, the name of one of the Martian months. Hubert Penrose went on to explain, showing the photostat. Tony Latimer took it, glanced at it, and dropped it on the table. Sounds plausible, of course, but just an assumption. That word may not be the name of a month, at all, could mean published or authorized or copyrighted or anything like that. Fact is, I don't think it's more than a wild guess that thing's anything like a periodical. He dismissed the subject and turned to Penrose. I picked out the next building to enter, that tall one with the conical thing on top. It ought to be in pretty good shape inside, the conical top wouldn't allow dust to accumulate, and from the outside nothing seems to be caved in or crushed. Ground level's higher than the other one, about the 7th floor. I found a good place and drilled for the shots. Tomorrow I'll blast a hole in it, and if you can spare some people to help, we can start exploring it right away. Yes, of course, Dr. Latimer. I can spare about a dozen, and I suppose you can find a few civilian volunteers, Penrose told him. What will you need in the way of equipment? Oh, about 6 demolition packets, they can all be shot together. And the usual thing in the way of lights, and breaking and digging tools, and climbing equipment in case we run into broken or doubtful stairways. We'll divide into 2 parties. Nothing ought to be entered for the first time without a qualified archaeologist along. 3 parties, if Martha can tear herself away from this catalog of systematized incomprehensibilities she's making long enough to do some real work. She felt her chest tighten and her face become stiff. She was pressing her lips together to lock in a furious retort when Hubert Penrose answered for her. Dr. Dane's been doing as much work, and as important work as you have, he said brusquely. More important work, I'd be inclined to say. Von Olmhorst was visibly distressed. He glanced once toward Sid Chamberlain, then looked hastily away from him. Afraid of a story of dissension among archaeologists getting out. Working out a system of pronunciation by which the Martian language could be transliterated was a most important contribution, he said. And Martha did that almost unassisted. Unassisted by Dr. Latimer, anyway, Penrose added. Captain Field and Lieutenant Koremitsu did some work, and I helped out a little, but 9/10 of it she did herself. Purely arbitrary, Latimer disdained. Why, we don't even know that the Martians could make the same kind of vocal sounds we do. Oh, yes, we do, Ivan Fitzgerald contradicted, safe on his own ground. I haven't seen any actual Martian skulls. These people seem to have been very tidy about disposing of their dead, but from statues and busts and pictures I've seen, I'd say that their vocal organs were identical with our own. Well, grant that. And grant that it's going to be impressive to rattle off the names of Martian notables whose statues we find, and that if we're ever able to attribute any place names, they'll sound a lot better than this horse doctor's Latin the old astronomers splashed all over the map of Mars, Latimer said. What I object to is her wasting time on this stuff, of which nobody will ever be able to read a word if she fiddles around with those lists till there's another 100 feet of loss on this city, when there's so much real work to be done and we're as short-handed as we are. That was the first time that had come out in just so many words. She was glad Latimer had said it and not Selim von Olmhorst. What you mean, she retorted, is that it doesn't have the publicity value that digging up statues has. For an instant, she could see that the shot had scored. Then Latimer, with a side glance at Chamberlain, answered. What I mean is that you're trying to find something that any archaeologist, yourself included, should know doesn't exist. I don't object to your gambling your professional reputation and making a laughingstock of yourself. What I object to is that the blunders of one archaeologist discredit the whole subject in the eyes of the public. That seemed to be what worried Latimer most. She was framing a reply when the communication outlet whistled shrilly, and then squawked, "Cocktail time. 1 hour to dinner, cocktails in the library, hut 4. The library, which was also lounge, recreation room, and general gathering place, was already crowded. Most of the crowd was at the long table topped with sheets of glass-like plastic that had been wall panels out of one of the ruined buildings. She poured herself what passed, here, for a martini, and carried it over to where Selim von Olmhorst was sitting alone. For a while, they talked about the building they had just finished exploring, then drifted into reminiscences of their work on Terra von Olmhorst's in Asia Minor, with the Hittite Empire, and hers in Pakistan, excavating the cities of the Harappa civilization. They finished their drinks. The ingredients were plentiful, alcohol and flavoring extracts synthesized from Martian vegetation, and von Olmhorst took the 2 glasses to the table for refills. You know, Martha, he said, when he returned, Tony was right about one thing. You are gambling your professional standing and reputation. It's against all archaeological experience that a language so completely dead as this one could be deciphered. There was a continuity between all the other ancient languages. By knowing Greek, Champollion learned to read Egyptian. By knowing Egyptian, Hittite was learned. That's why you and your colleagues have never been able to translate the Harappa hieroglyphics. No such continuity exists there. If you insist that this utterly dead language can be read, your reputation will suffer for it. I heard Colonel Penrose say, once, that an officer who's afraid to risk his military reputation seldom makes much of a reputation. It's the same with us. If we really want to find things out, we have to risk making mistakes. And I'm a lot more interested in finding things out than I am in my reputation. She glanced across the room, to where Tony Latimer was sitting with Gloria Standish, talking earnestly, while Gloria sipped one of the counterfeit martinis and listened. Gloria was the leading contender for the title of Miss Mars, 1996, if you liked big-bosomy blondes, but Tony would have been just as attentive to her if she'd looked like the Wicked Witch in The Wizard of Oz, because Gloria was the Pan-Federation telecast system commentator with the expedition. "I know you are," the old Turco-German was saying. "That's why, when they asked me to name another archaeologist for this expedition, I named you." He hadn't named Tony Latimer. Latimer had been pushed onto the expedition by his university. There'd been a lot of high-level string-pulling to that. She wished she knew the whole story. She'd managed to keep clear of universities and university politics. All her digs had been sponsored by non-academic foundations or art museums. "You have an excellent standing, much better than my own, at your age. That's why it disturbs me to see you jeopardizing it by this insistence that the Martian language can be translated. I can't, really, see how you can hope to succeed." She shrugged and drank some more of her cocktail, then lit another cigarette. It was getting tiresome to try to verbalize something she only felt. "Neither do I, now, but I will. Maybe I'll find something like the picture book Sachiko was talking about. A child's primer, maybe. Surely they had things like that. And if I don't, I'll find something else. We've only been here 6 months. I can wait the rest of my life, if I have to, but I'll do it sometime." "I can't wait so long," von Olmhorst said. "The rest of my life will only be a few years, and when the Schiaparelli orbits in, I'll be going back to Terra on the Sereno." "I wish you wouldn't. This is a whole new world of archaeology. Literally." "Yes." He finished the cocktail and looked at his pipe as though wondering whether to relight it so soon before dinner, then put it in his pocket. "A whole new world, but I've grown old, and it isn't for me. I've spent my life studying the Hittites. I can speak the Hittite language, though maybe King Muwatallis wouldn't be able to understand my modern Turkish accent. But the things I'd have to learn here: chemistry, physics, engineering, how to run analytic tests on steel girders and beryllo silver alloys and plastics and silicones. I'm more at home with a civilization that rode in chariots and fought with swords and was just learning how to work iron. Mars is for young people. This expedition is a cadre of leadership, not only the Space Force people, who'll be the commanders of the main expedition, but us scientists, too. And I'm just an old cavalry general who can't learn to command tanks and aircraft. You'll have time to learn about Mars. I won't." His reputation as the dean of Hittitologists was solid and secure, too, she added mentally. Then she felt ashamed of the thought. He wasn't to be classed with Tony Latimer. "All I came for was to get the work started," he was continuing. "The Federation government felt that an old hand should do that. Well, it started. Now, you and Tony and whoever come out on the Schiaparelli must carry it on. You said it yourself, you have a whole new world. This is only one city, of the last Martian civilization. Behind this, you have the late upland culture, and the canal builders, and all the civilizations and races and empires before them, clear back to the Martian Stone Age." He hesitated for a moment. "You have no idea what all you have to learn, Martha. This isn't the time to start specializing too narrowly." They all got out of the truck and stretched their legs and looked up the road to the tall building with the queer conical cap askew on its top. The 4 little figures that had been busy against its wall climbed into the jeep and started back slowly, the smallest of them, Sachiko Koremitsu, paying out an electric cable behind. When it pulled up beside the truck, they climbed out. Sachiko attached the free end of the cable to a nuclear electric battery. At once, dirty gray smoke and orange dust puffed out from the wall of the building, and, a second later, the multiple explosion banged. She and Tony Latimer and Major Lindemann climbed onto the truck, leaving the jeep stand by the road. When they reached the building, a satisfyingly wide breach had been blown in the wall. Latimer had placed his shots between two of the windows. They were both blown out along with the wall between, and lay unbroken on the ground. Martha remembered the first building they had entered. A Space Force officer had picked up a stone and thrown it at one of the windows, thinking that would be all they'd need to do. It had bounced back. He had drawn his pistol, they'd all carried guns, then, on the principle that what they didn't know about Mars might easily hurt them, and fired 4 shots. The bullets had ricocheted, screaming thinly. There were 4 coppery smears of jacket metal on the window, and a little surface spalling. Somebody tried a rifle. The 4000 F.S bullet had cracked the glass-like pane without penetrating. An oxyacetylene torch had taken an hour to cut the window out. The lab crew, aboard the ship, were still trying to find out just what the stuff was. Tony Latimer had gone forward and was sweeping his flashlight back and forth, swearing petulantly, his voice harshened and amplified by his helmet speaker. "I thought I was blasting into a hallway. This lets us into a room. Careful, there's about a 2-foot drop to the floor, and a lot of rubble from the blast just inside." He stepped down through the breach. The others began dragging equipment out of the trucks, shovels and picks and crowbars and sledges, portable floodlights, cameras, sketching materials, an extension ladder, even alpinists' ropes and crampons and pickaxes. Hubert Penrose was shouldering something that looked like a surrealist machine gun but which was really a nuclear electric jackhammer. Martha selected one of the spike-shod mountaineer ice axes, with which she could dig or chop or poke or pry or help herself over rough footing. The windows, grimed and crusted with 50 millennia of dust, filtered in a dim twilight. Even the breach in the wall, in the morning shade, lighted only a small patch of floor. Somebody snapped on a floodlight, aiming it at the ceiling. The big room was empty and bare. Dust lay thick on the floor and reddened the once white walls. It could have been a large office, but there was nothing left in it to indicate its use. "This one's been stripped up to the 7th floor," Latimer exclaimed. "Street level be cleaned out, completely. Due for living quarters and shops, then," Lindemann said. "Added to the others, this'll take care of everybody on the Schiaparelli." "Seem to have been a lot of electric or electronic apparatus over along this wall," one of the Space Force officers commented. 10 or 12 electric outlets." He brushed the dusty wall with his glove, then scraped on the floor with his foot. "I can see where things were pried loose." The door, one of the double sliding things the Martians had used, was closed. Celine von Olmhorst tried it, but it was stuck fast. The metal latch parts had frozen together, molecule bonding itself to molecule, since the door had last been closed. Hubert Penrose came over with the jackhammer, fitting a spearpoint chisel into place. He set the chisel in the joint between the doors, braced the hammer against his hip, and squeezed the trigger switch. The hammer banged briefly like the weapon it resembled, and the doors popped a few inches apart, then stuck. Enough dust had worked into the recesses into which it was supposed to slide to block it on both sides. That was old stuff. They ran into that every time they had to force a door, and they were prepared for it. Somebody went outside and brought in a power jack, and finally one of the doors inched back to the door jamb. That was enough to get the lights and equipment through. They all passed from the room to the hallway beyond. About half the other doors were open, each had a number and a single word, Darfalva, over it. One of the civilian volunteers, a woman professor of natural ecology from Penn State University, was looking up and down the hall. "You know," she said, "I feel at home here. I think this was a college of some sort, and these were classrooms. That word, up there, that was the subject taught, or the department. And those electronic devices, all where the class would face them, audiovisual teaching aids. A 25-story university?" Latimer scoffed. "Why, a building like this would handle 30,000 students." Maybe there were that many. This was a big city, in its prime, Martha said, moved chiefly by a desire to oppose Latimer. Yes, but think of the snafu in the halls, every time they changed classes. It'd take half an hour to get everybody back and forth from one floor to another. He turned to von Olmhorst. I'm going up above this floor. This place has been looted clean up to here, but there's a chance there may be something above, he said. I'll stay on this floor, at present, the Turco-German replied. There will be much coming and going, and dragging things in and out. We should get this completely examined and recorded first. Then Major Lindemann's people can do their worst, here. Well, if nobody else wants it, I'll take the downstairs, Martha said. I'll go along with you, Hubert Penrose told her. If the lower floors have no archaeological value, we'll turn them into living quarters. I like this building, it'll give everybody room to keep out from under everybody else's feet. He looked down the hall. We ought to find escalators at the middle. The hallway, too, was thick underfoot with dust. Most of the open rooms were empty, but a few contained furniture, including small seat desks. The original proponent of the university theory pointed these out as just what might be found in classrooms. There were escalators, up and down, on either side of the hall, and more on the intersecting passage to the right. That's how they handled the students, between classes, Martha commented. And I'll bet there are more ahead, there. They came to a stop where the hallway ended at a great square central hall. There were elevators, there, on two of the sides, and 4 escalators, still usable as stairways. But it was the walls, and the paintings on them, that brought them up short and staring. They were clouded with dirt. She was trying to imagine what they must have looked like originally, and at the same time estimating the labor that would be involved in cleaning them, but they were still distinguishable, as was the word, Darfolva, in golden letters above each of the 4 sides. It was a moment before she realized, from the murals, that she had at last found a meaningful Martian word. They were a vast historical panorama, clockwise around the room. A group of skin-clad savages squatting around a fire. Hunters with bows and spears, carrying a carcass of an animal slightly like a pig. Nomads riding long-legged, graceful mounts like hornless deer. Peasants sowing and reaping, mud-walled hut villages and cities, processions of priests and warriors, battles with swords and bows, and with cannon and muskets, galleys, and ships with sails, and ships without visible means of propulsion, and aircraft. Changing costumes and weapons and machines and styles of architecture. A richly fertile landscape, gradually merging into barren deserts and bushlands, the time of the great planet-wide drought. The canal builders, men with machines recognizable as steam shovels and derricks, digging and quarrying and driving across the empty plains with aqueducts. More cities, seaports on the shrinking oceans, dwindling, half-deserted cities, an abandoned city, with 4 tiny humanoid figures and a thing like a combat car in the middle of a brush-grown plaza, they and their vehicle dwarfed by the huge lifeless buildings around them. She had not the least doubt, Darfolva was history. Wonderful, von Olmhorst was saying. The entire history of this race. Why, if the painter depicted appropriate costumes and weapons and machines for each period, and got the architecture right, we can break the history of this planet into eras and periods and civilizations. You can assume they're authentic. The faculty of this university would insist on authenticity in the Darfolva History Department, she said. Yes. Darfolva History. And your magazine was a journal of Sornhulva. Penrose exclaimed. You have a word, Martha. It took her an instant to realize that he had called her by her first name, and not Dr. Dane. She wasn't sure if that weren't a bigger triumph than learning a word of the Martian language. Or a more auspicious start. Alone, I suppose that Hulva means something like science or knowledge, or study. Combined, it would be equivalent to aurology. And Darf would mean something like past, or old times, or human events, or chronicles. That gives you 3 words, Martha. Sachiko jubilated. You did it. Let's don't go too fast, Latimer said, for once not derisively. I'll admit that Darfulva is the Martian word for history as a subject of study. I'll admit that Hulva is the general word and Darf modifies it and tells us which subject is meant. But as for assigning specific meanings, we can't do that because we don't know just how the Martians thought, scientifically or otherwise. He stopped short, startled by the blue-white light that blazed as Sid Chamberlain's Kliegets went on. When the whirring of the camera stopped, it was Chamberlain who was speaking. This is the biggest thing yet. The whole history of Mars, Stone Age to the end, all on 4 walls. I'm taking this with the fast shutter, but we'll telecast it in slow motion, from the beginning to the end. Tony, I want you to do the voice for it, running commentary, interpretation of each scene as it's shown. Would you do that? Would he do that? Martha thought. If he had a tail, he'd be wagging it at the very thought. Well, there ought to be more murals on the other floors, she said. Who wants to come downstairs with us? Sachiko did, immediately. Ivan Fitzgerald volunteered. Sid decided to go upstairs with Tony Latimer, and Gloria Standish decided to go upstairs, too. Most of the party would remain on the 7th floor, to help Celine von Olmhorst get it finished. After poking tentatively at the escalator with the spike of her ice axe, Martha led the way downward. The 6th floor was Darfulva, too, military and technological history, from the character of the murals. They looked around the central hall, and went down to the 5th. It was like the floors above except that the big quadrangle was stacked with dusty furniture in boxes. Ivan Fitzgerald, who was carrying the floodlight, swung it slowly around. Here the murals were of heroic-sized Martians, so human in appearance as to seem members of her own race, each holding some object, a book, or a test tube, or some bit of scientific apparatus, and behind them were scenes of laboratories and factories, flame and smoke, lightning flashes. The word at the top of each of the 4 walls was one with which she was already familiar, Sornhalva. Hey, Martha, there's that word, Ivan Fitzgerald exclaimed. The one in the title of your magazine. He looked at the paintings. Chemistry, or physics? Both. Hubert Penrose considered. I don't think the Martians made any sharp distinction between them. See, the old fellow with the scraggly whiskers must be the inventor of the spectroscope. He has one in his hands, and he has a rainbow behind him. And the woman in the blue smock, beside him, worked in organic chemistry. See the diagrams of long-chain molecules behind her. What word would convey the idea of chemistry and physics taken as one subject? Sornhalva, Sachiko suggested. If Hulva's something like science, Sorn must mean matter, or substance, or physical object. You were right, all along, Martha. A civilization like this would certainly leave something like this. That would be self-explanatory. This'll wipe a little more of that superior grin off Tony Latimer's face, Fitzgerald was saying, as they went down the motionless escalator to the floor below. Tony wants to be a big shot. When you want to be a big shot, you can't bear the possibility of anybody else being a bigger big shot, and whoever makes a start on reading this language will be the biggest big shot archaeology ever saw. That was true. She hadn't thought of it, in that way, before, and now she tried not to think about it. She didn't want to be a big shot. She wanted to be able to read the Martian language, and find things out about the Martians. 2 escalators down, they came out on a mezzanine around a wide central hall on the street level, the floor 40 feet below them and the ceiling 30 feet above. Their lights picked out object after object below, a huge group of sculptured figures in the middle, some kind of a motor vehicle jacked up on trestles for repairs, things that looked like machine guns and autocannon, long tables, tops littered with a dust-covered miscellany, machinery, boxes and crates and containers. They made their way down and walked among the clutter, missing 100 things for everyone they saw, until they found an escalator to the basement. There were 3 basements, one under another, until at last they stood at the bottom of the last escalator, on a bare concrete floor, swinging the portable floodlight over stacks of boxes and barrels and drums, and heaps of powdery dust. The boxes were plastic, nobody had ever found anything made of wood in the city, and the barrels and drums were of metal or glass or some glass-like substance. They were outwardly intact. The powdery heaps might have been anything organic, or anything containing fluid. Down here, where wind and dust could not reach, evaporation had been the only force of destruction after the minute life that caused putrefaction had vanished. They found refrigeration rooms, too, and using Martha's ice axe and the pistol-like vibratol Sachiko carried on her belt, they pounded and pried one open, to find desiccated piles of what had been vegetables, and leathery chunks of meat. Samples of that stuff, rocketed up to the ship, would give a reliable estimate, by radiocarbon dating, of how long ago this building had been occupied. The refrigeration unit, radically different from anything their own culture had produced, had been electrically powered. Sachiko and Penrose, poking into it, found the switches still on. The machine had only ceased to function when the power source, whatever that had been, had failed. The middle basement had also been used, at least toward the end, for storage. It was cut in half by a partition pierced by but one door. They took half an hour to force this, and were on the point of sending above for heavy equipment when it yielded enough for them to squeeze through. Fitzgerald, in the lead with the light, stopped short, looked around, and then gave a groan that came through his helmet speaker like a foghorn. "Oh, no! No! What's the matter, Ivan?" Sachiko, entering behind him, asked anxiously. He stepped aside. "Look at it, Sachi. Are we going to have to do all that?" Martha crowded through behind her friend and looked around, then stood motionless, dizzy with excitement. Books. Case on case of books, half an acre of cases, 15 feet to the ceiling. Fitzgerald and Penrose, who had pushed in behind her, were talking in rapid excitement. She only heard the sound of their voices, not their words. This must be the main stacks of the university library, the entire literature of the vanished race of Mars. In the center, down an aisle between the cases, she could see the hollow square of the librarian's desk, and stairs and a dumbwaiter to the floor above. She realized that she was walking forward, with the others, toward this. Sachiko was saying, "I'm the lightest, let me go first." She must be talking about the spidery metal stairs. "I'd say they were safe," Penrose answered. "The trouble we've had with doors around here shows that the metal hasn't deteriorated." In the end, the Japanese girl led the way, more cat-like than ever in her caution. The stairs were quite sound, in spite of their fragile appearance, and they all followed her. The floor above was a duplicate of the room they had entered, and seemed to contain about as many books. Rather than waste time forcing the door here, they returned to the middle basement and came up by the escalator down which they had originally descended. The upper basement contained kitchens, electric stoves, some with pots and pans still on them, and a big room that must have been, originally, the students' dining room, though when last used it had been a workshop. As they expected, the library reading room was on the street-level floor, directly above the stacks. It seemed to have been converted into a sort of common living room for the building's last occupants. An adjoining auditorium had been made into a chemical works. There were vats and distillation apparatus, and a metal fractionating tower that extended through a hole knocked in the ceiling 70 feet above. A good deal of plastic furniture of the sort they had been finding everywhere in the city was stacked about, some of it broken up, apparently for reprocessing. The other rooms on the street floor seemed also to have been devoted to manufacturing and repair work, a considerable industry, along a number of lines, Must have been carried on here for a long time after the university had ceased to function as such.
On the second floor, they found a museum. Many of the exhibits remained, tantalizingly half-visible in grimed glass cases.
There had been administrative offices there, too. The doors of most of them were closed, and they did not waste time trying to force them, but those that were open had been turned into living quarters. They made notes, and rough floor plans, to guide them in future more thorough examination. It was almost noon before they had worked their way back to the 7th floor. Selim von Olmhorst was in a room on the north side of the building, sketching the position of things before examining them and collecting them for removal. He had the floor checkerboard with a grid of chalked lines, each numbered. "We have everything on this floor photographed," he said. "I have 3 gangs, all the floodlights I have sketching in making measurements. At the rate we're going, with time out for lunch, we'll be finished by the middle of the afternoon." "You've been working fast. Evidently you aren't being high church about a qualified archaeologist entering rooms first," Penrose commented. Childishness," the old man exclaimed impatiently. "These officers of yours aren't fools. All of them have been to intelligence school and criminal investigation school. Some of the most careful amateur archaeologists I ever knew were retired soldiers or policemen. But there isn't much work to be done. Most of the rooms are either empty or, like this one, a few bits of furniture and broken trash and scraps of paper. Did you find anything down on the lower floors?" "Well, yes," Penrose said, a hint of mirth in his voice. "What would you say, Martha?" She started to tell Selim. The others, unable to restrain their excitement, broke in with interruptions. Von Olmhorst was staring in incredulous amazement. "But this floor was looted almost clean, and the buildings we've entered before were all looted from the street level up," he said, at length. "The people who looted this one lived here," Penrose replied. "They had electric power to the last. We found refrigerators full of food, and stoves with the dinner still on them. They must have used the elevators to haul things down from the upper floor. The whole first floor was converted into workshops and laboratories. I think that this place must have been something like a monastery in the Dark Ages in Europe, or what such a monastery would have been like if the Dark Ages had followed the fall of a highly developed scientific civilization. For one thing, we found a lot of machine guns and light autocannon on the street level, and all the doors were barricaded. The people here were trying to keep a civilization running after the rest of the planet had gone back to barbarism. I suppose they'd have to fight off raids by the barbarians now and then." "You're not going to insist on making this building into expedition quarters, I hope, Colonel?" von Olmhorst asked anxiously. "Oh, no. This place is an archaeological treasure house. More than that, from what I saw, our technicians can learn a lot here. But you'd better get this floor cleaned up as soon as you can, though. I'll have the subsurface part, from the 6th floor down, air-sealed. Then we'll put in oxygen generators and power units, and get a couple of elevators into service. For the floors above, we can use temporary air sealing floor by floor, and portable equipment. When we have things atmosphered and lighted and heated, you and Martha and Tony Latimer can go to work systematically and in comfort, and I'll give you all the help I can spare from the other work. This is one of the biggest things we've found yet." Tony Latimer and his companions came down to the 7th floor a little later. "I don't get this, at all," he began, as soon as he joined them. "This building wasn't stripped the way the others were. Always, the procedure seems to have been to strip from the bottom up, but they seem to have stripped the top floors first, here. All but the very top. I found out what that conical thing is, by the way. It's a wind rotor, and under it there's an electric generator. This building generated its own power." "What sort of condition are the generators in?" Penrose asked. Well, everything's full of dust that blew in under the rotor, of course, but it looks to be in pretty good shape. Hey, I'll bet that's it. They had power, so they used the elevators to haul stuff down. That's just what they did. Some of the floors above here don't seem to have been touched, though. He paused momentarily. Back of his oxy mask, he seemed to be grinning. I don't know that I ought to mention this in front of Martha, but 2 floors above, we hit a room. It must have been the reference library for one of the departments that had close to 500 books in it. The noise that interrupted him, like the squawking of a Brobdingnagian parrot, was only Ivan Fitzgerald laughing through his helmet speaker. Lunch at the huts was a hasty meal, with a gabble of full-mouthed and excited talking. Hubert Penrose and his chief subordinates snatched their food in a huddled consultation at one end of the table. In the afternoon, work was suspended on everything else, and the 50-odd men and women of the expedition concentrated their efforts on the university. By the middle of the afternoon, the 7th floor had been completely examined, photographed and sketched, and the murals in the square central hall covered with protective tarpaulins, and Laurent Jekyll and his air sealing crew had moved in and were at work. It had been decided to seal the central hall at the entrances. It took the French-Canadian engineer most of the afternoon to find all the ventilation ducts and plug them. An elevator shaft on the north side was found reaching clear to the 25th floor. This would give access to the top of the building. Another shaft, from the center, would take care of the floors below. Nobody seemed willing to trust the ancient elevators themselves. It was the next evening before a couple of cars and the necessary machinery could be fabricated in the machine shops aboard the ship and sent down by landing rocket. By that time, the air sealing was finished, the nuclear electric energy converters were in place, and the oxygen generators set up.